The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound that broke the stillness of the woods was the steady crunch of leaves beneath his boots. The trees towered high above, their twisted branches casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He had been walking for what felt like hours, guided only by the trail his feet instinctively followed, when he heard it the faintest of noises, like a soft rustling, barely noticeable, yet enough to catch his attention. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then, the rustling came again, louder this time. It was too rhythmic to be a random gust. His heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the thick underbrush, something moved. He froze, his pulse quickening. His mind raced with questions. Was it an animal? A deer perhaps, or something else entirely? He took a cautious step forward, trying to peer through the tangle of leaves and branches. And then, through the haze of green and brown, he saw it. A small pony, its coat a mix of chestnut and white, standing perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for him. Its big, dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking, as if it too had been listening for his approach. His breath caught in his throat. He had grown up in this town, and he knew the woods better than anyone. He had explored every corner, every hidden path, but he had never seen anything like this. The pony wasn't wild, he could tell. It was too calm, too gentle, standing alone in the middle of a forest where no one ever seemed to go. And yet it looked lost. He took another step forward, a mix of curiosity and caution taking over. The pony didn't move, but its ears twitched slightly as if it was waiting for something. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. This wasn't a normal encounter. He'd heard stories, of course stories from his grandparents about strange happenings in these very woods, but those were just stories, weren't they? Tales told around campfires to scare children. But the pony's presence here felt too real, too urgent, to be written off as mere folklore. The sunlight barely filtered through the canopy above, casting a dim light that made the forest seem even more mysterious. It was almost as if the trees themselves were closing in, surrounding him with their silent watchfulness. He had always loved these woods, but now, with the pony standing before him, it felt different, like the forest was hiding something. He could feel it in his bones, a strange pull that urged him forward. But the pony, though calm, seemed to be beckoning him towards something. He took a deep breath and stepped closer, the leaves crunching underfoot. The pony's coat was matted in places, and its hooves were chipped, as if it had been wandering for days. It didn't seem to be in pain, but it was clearly alone. There was a faint scent in the air, a scent that didn't belong to the forest. Something sweet, like flowers, but with an undercurrent of something else, something he couldn't quite place. The closer he got, the more he felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just any lost pony. There was something about it, something hidden beneath the surface. And then, as he reached out to gently touch its mane, the pony flinched, as if startled by his touch. But it didn't run. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, revealing something that had been hidden beneath its tangled mane. A small, golden pendant, hanging from its neck on a delicate chain, caught the dim light of the forest. His fingers brushed against it, and the moment he touched the pendant, the pony gave a soft whinny, its eyes widening, as if it recognized the contact. A strange pulse of energy seemed to flow through him, as if the very air around him had shifted. The pendant seemed familiar, but he couldn't place why. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, smooth, intricate, with strange markings etched into its surface. He wondered how it had come to be here, on a pony that had wandered into these woods alone. But before he could examine it further, the pony jerked its head away, a soft whinny escaping its lips. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble slightly, and the air grew colder. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The pony began to step backward, its hooves tapping the ground rhythmically. And then, before he could react, the world around him seemed to blur. The trees around him appeared to shift, their shapes warping as though they were moving in a way they shouldn't. The pony's eyes were wide with fear now, and the tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. A sudden crack echoed through the trees, louder than anything he had ever heard in these woods. The ground shook again, stronger this time, and the pony bolted, disappearing into the shadows with a speed he hadn't expected. For a moment, he stood there, frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been a trick of the light? Or was something more at play here? Something ancient, something connected to the pony and the pendant it wore? He stood there, staring at the spot where the pony had been, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. What was this pony doing in the woods? And why did it have that strange pendant? There was more to this encounter than met the eye. And just as quickly as the strange events had begun, they had ended. But the mystery was far from over. What lay ahead for him in the woods? Would he uncover the hidden secrets of the forest and the lost pony? Or would the forest keep its mysteries buried, waiting for the next person brave enough to uncover the truth? The air was still once more, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. He knew one thing for sure: his journey into these woods had only just begun. The pony had vanished into the woods with a speed that left him standing in silence, his mind whirling, unsure of what had just happened. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the creature whole, taking it back into the shadows from which it had emerged. He looked around, his heart still pounding, but the woods now seemed even more alive, more watchful. It was as if the trees were waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what he had just experienced. He could almost feel the eyes of the forest on him, a silent witness to something that defied explanation. He stood there for a long moment, his feet frozen in place. The world around him was still, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, but there was an unnatural stillness that seemed to creep into the very bones of the forest. He glanced down at the ground where the pony had been, hoping to see some sign of its presence, but the earth was undisturbed. There were no tracks, no trail to follow, nothing that would suggest it had been there at all. It was as if the pony had never existed, and yet he knew it had. He had seen it with his own eyes, touched it, felt its presence. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. Maybe it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, but he didn't believe that for a second. There was something more to this, something hidden beneath the surface. The pendant, the strange energy he felt when he touched it, everything pointed to something beyond the ordinary. But what? With a deep breath, he turned and began to walk back toward the direction he thought he had come from. The woods seemed even darker now, the trees closing in on him as if trying to keep him from leaving. He kept his pace steady, not wanting to let the unease settle into panic. The pony had gone, but the feeling of something else watching him lingered. Every snap of a twig, every shift in the wind felt like a reminder that the woods were not what they seemed. There was a story here, buried beneath layers of time and silence, and somehow, he was tangled in it. As he made his way back, he tried to push the thoughts from his mind, but they clung to him. Who had left that pendant on the pony? Why had it been wandering the woods alone? What did it all mean? He had to know. He had to find out. But where would he even begin? The woods were vast, and it wasn't like there were answers waiting to be uncovered. Not here. Not in a place where people came and went, and everything seemed ordinary on the surface. When he finally made it out of the woods and back to his small town, it was nearly dark. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear above. He paused at the edge of the trees, glancing back into the shadows where the pony had disappeared. He could still feel the pull of the forest, an unspoken call that made it impossible to just forget what had happened. But there was no time to dwell on it. Not yet. He had to figure out what to do next. The town seemed unchanged, quiet, and peaceful as it always was at this time of night. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car driving by, the hum of distant conversations carried on the wind. It felt normal, but the normalcy was unsettling. How could everything feel so ordinary when he knew there was something strange hiding just beneath the surface? How could the world feel so calm when he knew the woods were holding secrets that were now calling to him? He walked home slowly, trying to shake off the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. His house was small, tucked at the edge of town, the kind of place that felt like it had always been there. His family had lived in the same house for generations, and though it wasn't anything fancy, it was home. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood and old books filling the air. But even here, in the safety of his own space, the mystery of the woods seemed to follow him. The living room was dim, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner. His parents were asleep upstairs, and the house was still, as it always was at this hour. He should have felt comforted by the quiet, but instead, he felt a gnawing unease, an unshakable sense that something was wrong. The pendant. The pony. The way the world had seemed to warp and shift in the woods. None of it made sense, and yet it felt connected. He had to know what it all meant. But where to start? He sat down at the small table in the kitchen, his mind racing. The pendant. It was the only clue he had. It was beautiful, unlike anything he had ever seen, and yet it seemed so familiar, like a part of a dream he couldn't quite remember. He pulled out the small necklace he had taken from the pony and examined it closely. The markings on the pendant were intricate, delicate, almost like symbols, but they didn't match anything he recognized. It didn't look like anything from the area, not like any kind of jewelry or artifact he had ever seen before. Could it be old? Ancient even? But how could a relic from some forgotten time end up on a lost pony in the woods? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this pendant than just its odd appearance. It felt like it was hiding something important. And the pony. It had been so odd, too. Why had it been in the woods? And why had it reacted the way it did when he touched it? The strange energy he felt when his fingers brushed against the pendant, the way the air around him seemed to shift, it was almost as if the pony was trying to communicate something. But what? And why had it run off when he tried to investigate further? He stood up abruptly, the pendant still in his hand. He couldn't keep waiting for answers to fall into his lap. There had to be someone who could help him understand what was happening, someone who knew more about the woods, about the strange things that lurked there. He didn't know who that someone was, but he was sure they were out there. The answer was out there. The night stretched on, the house silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. But the feeling of unease, of something unresolved, was impossible to ignore. There was a story here, and he was just beginning to uncover it. But with every step he took, the mystery deepened, and the danger seemed to grow. What had he stumbled upon in those woods? And who or what was behind it all? As he sat there, staring at the pendant, he couldn't help but wonder if he was being drawn into something much larger than he could ever have imagined. Something that had been hidden for a long time. Something that might just be more dangerous than he was prepared to face. He placed the pendant carefully on the table, and for a moment, just before the darkness of the night settled in around him, he thought he saw something flicker, something in the shadows. But when he looked again, it was gone. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something far beyond his control, was stronger than ever. The night stretched on, quiet and still, but the tension in the air only seemed to grow thicker with every passing moment. He sat at the table, staring at the pendant, his mind racing with questions. What was its purpose? What secrets did it hold? And more importantly, why had the pony been wearing it? There was something about that moment in the woods, something about the way the pony had reacted when he touched the pendant, that stuck with him. It was as if the object held power, a power that had been waiting for someone to unlock it. But why him? Why now? He rubbed his forehead, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling that this was just the beginning. The pendant wasn't just a trinket, it was a key, he was sure of it. A key to something far larger and more dangerous than he could even begin to understand. The way the forest seemed to come alive when he touched it, the strange energy that pulsed through the air, it was all connected, somehow. The pony, the woods, the pendant, it was as though some ancient force had been waiting for this very moment. But what was it waiting for? The soft creak of the stairs above broke his thoughts. He glanced up, a jolt of panic surging through him. His parents were home, and though they had always been supportive, they wouldn't understand what he had just experienced. They wouldn't understand why he couldn't let it go. It wasn't just the pony that intrigued him anymore. It was everything. The woods, the strange feeling that something was watching him, the weird pull he felt in his gut whenever he thought about what had happened, it was all too much to ignore. He slipped the pendant into his pocket, the weight of it a constant reminder of what had happened, and quietly made his way up to his room. There, in the dim light of his desk lamp, he sat down and opened the drawer, pulling out a notebook. For years, he had written down his thoughts, his musings on the world around him, his desire to uncover the hidden secrets of life. But this was different. This was no ordinary curiosity. Something was changing inside him, something deep and primal, and it was as if the world itself was urging him to seek out the answers. He flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over sketches of the woods, notes about local legends, and half-formed thoughts about the strange occurrences that had happened in town over the years. He had always been fascinated by the unexplained, the things that couldn't be easily understood. But now, with the pendant in his pocket, those half-formed ideas took on new weight. There was a link here, a connection he had yet to see, and the answer was hidden just beyond his reach. But he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and though he hated to admit it, he wasn't sure where to turn. He thought about the old woman who lived at the edge of town, a recluse who everyone whispered about but no one ever really spoke to. She was rumored to know things about the woods, things about the town's past that no one else seemed to know. It wasn't just her age that made people nervous, it was the fact that she had lived through the town's darkest years, and had seen more than anyone cared to remember. She might know something about the pendant, about the ancient forces at work. The thought made him uneasy, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. He had to go to her. He had to ask her what the pendant meant, what it was connected to. But as the thought settled in his mind, another thought crept in, more troubling than the first. What if she knew more than he was ready to hear? What if she knew things that would change everything? The decision gnawed at him as he lay in bed that night, the pendant still in his pocket, its presence like a constant pulse in the back of his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He had to learn more, even if the answers he found didn't bring the comfort he hoped for. But even as he steeled himself for the journey ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was already happening. The woods had changed him, had called to him in a way he hadn't expected. And it wasn't just the pendant, it was the town itself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there were strange things happening beneath the surface, things that people had been too afraid to confront. The next day, he set out early. The air was crisp, the sky clear, but the tension still hung heavy in the air. He made his way to the old woman's house, walking the familiar path through town, though today everything seemed different. The streets seemed quieter, the houses more distant, as though the town itself were holding its breath. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Every step he took, the sound of footsteps seemed to echo behind him. But when he turned, no one was there. The town was empty, as always. When he reached the house at the edge of town, he paused for a moment, taking in the dilapidated structure before him. It was old, far older than anything else in town, with vines creeping up its sides and the windows dark and lifeless. The house seemed to hold a quiet power, as if it had seen centuries pass and yet remained unchanged. He knocked once, twice, and then stepped back, waiting for a response. The door creaked open slowly, and there she was, the old woman, her weathered face framed by a mass of wild, silver hair. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, locked onto his with a look that seemed to see right through him. "You've come," she said, her voice raspy but strong. "I knew you would." He didn't know how to respond. How could she know? How could she have expected him? "I've been waiting for you," she continued, stepping aside to let him in. "You've touched the pendant, haven't you? The one that belongs to the woods." His heart raced. She knew. She knew everything. Yes," he stammered, his words coming out in a rush. "I found it. In the woods. But I don't understand. What is it? What does it mean?" The old woman smiled, though it wasn't a comforting smile. It was knowing, like someone who had seen too much, who had witnessed things that couldn't be undone. "It means you're in too deep now," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And there's no turning back." She led him inside, and as the door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The walls of the house were covered with strange symbols, old books piled high on every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of herbs and incense. It felt like stepping into another world entirely, a world where the boundaries between reality and myth no longer held true. "You want answers," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But the questions you ask will lead you into darkness. Are you ready for that?" He wasn't sure. But there was no turning back now. He had already touched the pendant. He had already stepped into the unknown. And the woods were waiting. The old woman's words hung in the air, thick with meaning, and yet they were like an unsolved puzzle. He stood there, barely able to breathe, as her eyes, deep and knowing, fixed on him. She had said the woods were waiting, but waiting for what? What exactly had he stumbled upon? His heart beat faster with every second that passed in that cramped, dimly lit room, surrounded by strange artifacts and symbols that felt as if they were alive in their own way. She motioned for him to sit, and he complied without thinking, his body moving on its own, pulled by a force he didn't understand. The air in the room was thick with something ancient, as though the very walls themselves carried the weight of centuries of secrets. "The pendant you found," she began, her voice slow, deliberate, "it belongs to something far older than you can imagine. And the pony, well, the pony is just the messenger. But you, boy, you are the key." He blinked, the words hitting him like a cold gust of wind. "The key? What do you mean?" The old woman leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "The forest has a power, a life of its own. It calls to those it chooses. And it has chosen you. The pony didn't just run from you, it was trying to warn you. There are forces at play that you cannot understand yet. Forces that are waiting to be unleashed." Her words sent a chill crawling up his spine. He had always felt like there was something just beyond his reach, something hidden within the very fabric of the world around him. But now, with the old woman's words hanging in the air, that feeling became something more. It was real. The forest, the pendant, the pony, they were all part of something much bigger. But what was it? And how could he stop it? "Why me?" His voice cracked slightly, a question he hadn't even fully realized he was asking until it left his lips. "Why am I the one who has to deal with this?" The old woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you gave someone when you knew they were about to face something far beyond their control. "Because the woods have been waiting for someone like you. And the pendant, well, it is more than just a piece of jewelry. It's a key, yes, but it's also a lock. It locks away something that was meant to stay buried." Her words were like whispers from another time, and each one added more weight to the air around them. "What is buried? What is locked away?" he asked, the desperation in his voice unmistakable. The old woman hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully, then finally spoke in a low voice, almost as though she were telling a secret she wasn't sure she should share. "Something ancient, something powerful, something that once ruled the land. It's been asleep for centuries, waiting. But now, the balance is shifting. The woods are changing. And you're the one who can either set it free, or keep it locked away forever." His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the room felt even darker, heavier. The pendant in his pocket suddenly seemed to burn against his skin, as though it were calling out to him, urging him to act. He stood up quickly, feeling the weight of her words like a physical force, pulling him in every direction at once. "I don't understand," he said, his mind spinning. "What do I do? How do I stop it? How do I?" She held up a hand, silencing him with a simple motion. "You can't stop it," she said quietly. "Not unless you do what the woods demand. And that is the real test. The forest doesn't just allow anyone to step into its heart. It tests you, it watches you, and if you are worthy, it will guide you. But if you fail," her voice trailed off, the threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "You must go back. Back to the woods." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. The woods. He had only just escaped their pull. And now, she was telling him to return? But there was no choice. There was no running from it. Whatever this was, whatever this ancient force was that had been waiting for centuries, it had chosen him. And now, it was calling him back. He turned to leave, but the old woman's voice stopped him once more. "One last thing," she said, her tone turning serious. "You must understand this, the pendant is not just a key. It is a piece of the forest itself. And if you choose to use it, you must be prepared for what lies on the other side. The woods will test you in ways you cannot imagine. You must be ready. Ready for whatever you find." With those final words hanging in the air, he stepped out into the night. The weight of the pendant in his pocket felt heavier than ever. The stars above seemed to watch him, the world around him impossibly still, as though waiting for the inevitable. The walk to the woods was long, but he didn't notice the time passing. He barely even noticed the path beneath his feet. All that mattered now was the pull, the draw of the forest that had started the moment he had first touched the pendant. It was like an invisible thread connecting him to the heart of the woods. And now, with each step, that thread grew tighter, pulling him towards something he wasn't ready to face but couldn't stop himself from reaching for. When the trees finally loomed ahead, the familiar shapes twisted into something darker. The air felt colder, the shadows longer. He paused at the edge, staring into the blackness. It was as if the forest itself was breathing, shifting, alive in ways he hadn't noticed before. The pendant in his pocket burned with an intensity that made his whole body tense. He didn't know what he would find if he entered the woods again, but the old woman's warning echoed in his mind, "You must be ready." The wind stirred the leaves around him, a whisper almost too quiet to hear, but he could feel it, something calling, something urging him forward. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the darkness, and as he did, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches creaking as though in warning. The woods were waiting. The woods were alive. And this time, there would be no turning back. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the shadows wrapping themselves around him. Every step felt like a step towards something far greater than he had ever imagined. His heart raced, his mind whirling with everything he had learned, everything he didn't understand. The pendant, he could feel it tugging at him, urging him forward, closer to whatever the woods were hiding. The deeper he walked, the more it felt like the forest was watching him. He could feel the eyes of unseen creatures, the breath of something ancient brushing against the back of his neck. He was being tested, just as the old woman had said. But what would happen if he failed? What would happen if he couldn't face whatever lay ahead? With every step, he could feel the tension rising, the weight of the forest pressing in on him, tightening around his chest like a vice. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand the pressure. The trees seemed to shift around him, their twisted forms growing ever more sinister, their shadows deeper. The forest was closing in. And in the distance, through the thickening fog, he saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the shadows. It was watching him. Waiting. The final test was about to begin. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer to the figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, its form hidden beneath the dark canopy of trees, but its presence was undeniable. Something about it made the air grow heavier, thicker, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. His pulse quickened, his feet frozen in place. This wasn't just another part of the woods. This was something else. Something he hadn't prepared for. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It simply stood there, unmoving, watching him with eyes that gleamed like shards of ice. He felt a sudden wave of unease, a realization crashing over him that this was the forest's test, the moment he had been walking toward since he first picked up the pendant. But it wasn't just a test. The air around him felt charged, as though something was about to snap, something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. He took a step forward, the ground beneath his feet soft and wet, as though the forest itself were swallowing him whole. Each step felt like a mistake, like a move that would lead him further into danger, but the pull of the pendant, the strange energy coursing through him, urged him on. The figure remained still, its form casting a long, dark shadow across the ground, stretching toward him like a waiting trap. He should turn back. The thought flickered in his mind, a fleeting moment of doubt. But before he could move, the figure spoke, its voice deep and hollow, as though it came from the very heart of the earth. "You shouldn't have come here." The words echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees, sending a ripple of dread through his body. It wasn't a voice of warning, it was a voice of authority, as if the very woods themselves were speaking through this figure. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure remained motionless for a moment, and then, in a slow, deliberate movement, it stepped into the dim light. The figure was no longer just a shadow, it was something far more unsettling. Its features were indistinct, but its eyes glowed, an unnatural shade of green that flickered like flames in the darkness. The air seemed to crackle with tension as it tilted its head, its gaze piercing. "I am what you have awakened," it said, its voice like wind through dry leaves, carrying a weight of inevitability. "And now that you have called me forth, you must face the consequences." The words hit him like a punch. Awakened? Called forth? His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of the town, but the pendant still burning in his pocket held him in place. The figure wasn't just a part of the forest, it was something more, something older, and he had somehow unleashed it. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain steady. The figure's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it was a twisted, cold thing. "What I want is irrelevant," it said. "What matters now is what the forest demands." He didn't understand. The forest? What was it demanding? A deep, uneasy feeling settled in his stomach, and as the figure's words hung in the air, another realization struck him. This wasn't just about the pendant. This wasn't just about the forest, or even the strange pony. There was something far more ancient at work here. Something that had been waiting for centuries, watching, biding its time. The figure seemed to read his mind, its eyes gleaming brighter. "You have become a part of something much larger than you can comprehend. The woods are not what you think they are. The woods are a living entity. It is a force that has existed since before the town was built, before the land was tamed. And now, because of you, it is awakening. Suddenly, the air shifted. The trees groaned, the ground beneath his feet trembling as though something deep within the earth were stirring. The figure raised its hand, and for a moment, the shadows around them seemed to stretch, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. The ground cracked, the earth pulling apart, and from the rift, a cold, unnatural wind began to blow, rustling the leaves and filling the air with an eerie hum. No, he whispered, taking a step back, his heart racing as the realization set in. This wasn't just a test, it was a reckoning. Before he could react, a distant sound echoed through the woods, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. It was a rhythmic thudding, like the beating of a heart, only it wasn't a heartbeat. It was a pulse that seemed to emanate from the very center of the woods, and it was getting closer. The figure in front of him didn't move, but its eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, followed the sound with an almost predatory gleam. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice thick with fear. The figure turned its gaze back to him, and for the first time, something like amusement flickered in its expression. "You are not the only one who has been drawn here," it said. "The woods are calling to more than just you. There are others. The forest has chosen its champions, and they are coming." The ground rumbled again, louder this time, and the trees shook as if something massive was making its way through the dense undergrowth. A low, guttural growl echoed in the distance, followed by the sound of something or someone moving swiftly through the woods. Whatever it was coming for him. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him like a physical force. The figure's smile grew wider. "You'll find out soon enough. But be warned, the forest doesn't give second chances. The price of awakening it is far greater than you can imagine." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The trees groaned louder, and the air turned thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The ground beneath him trembled again, and this time, he could feel it in his bones. He wasn't alone anymore. The forest was alive, and it was watching him. And soon, whatever this force was, whatever the figure was, would be the least of his problems. The thudding grew louder, closer. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward him like tendrils, and in the distance, through the trees, he saw movement. Figures dark, looming, emerged from the depths of the forest. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, creatures twisted and wrong, their shapes shifting in ways that defied nature. The forest wasn't just testing him anymore. It was hunting him. And whatever these creatures were, they were coming for him. He turned and ran, the pounding of his heart drowning out the thudding, the sound of the creature's approach, and the strange, haunting whispers of the woods calling to him. The forest had awakened. And it wasn't letting him go. His legs burned with exhaustion as he sprinted through the forest, the sounds of the creatures growing louder behind him, their twisted forms closing in. The thudding, that rhythmic pulse of something ancient and powerful, seemed to surround him, echoing through the trees, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. The air was thick, every breath a struggle, and his mind raced as he tried to process what he had just learned. The woods weren't just alive, they were something more, something older than he could ever imagine. And now, they were coming for him. His heart pounded as he weaved between the trees, desperate to put distance between himself and the creatures. But the forest felt like a maze, its paths twisting and shifting, leading him deeper into the unknown. The pendant in his pocket burned hotter than ever, its presence almost suffocating. He reached for it, pulling it from his coat and holding it in front of him like a talisman. The strange energy pulsed through it, almost as though it were alive, urging him to keep moving. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him, stepping out of the shadows with a fluid, unnatural grace. His breath hitched in his throat, his body freezing as he recognized the figure, the same one that had warned him earlier, the one whose eyes gleamed with that unnatural, otherworldly light. "You should have stayed away," the figure said, its voice low and menacing, filled with ancient power. His heart raced, but he didn't stop. The creatures were closing in, and he had no choice but to face whatever this figure was. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, desperation flooding his voice. The figure didn't respond at first. Instead, it seemed to study him, its glowing eyes narrowing as though weighing his very soul. Then, with a slight tilt of its head, it spoke again. "You don't understand, do you? The forest didn't just choose you. It needs you. You are the one who will either set it free or destroy it." The words struck him like a slap to the face. Destroy it? How could he possibly destroy the forest? It was alive, a force of nature in a way he could never have imagined. But the figure's words rang true. There was something powerful about the forest, something that was awakening, and he was caught in the middle of it all. "No," he gasped. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." The figure's eyes flashed, and for a moment, it almost seemed to pity him. "You think you have a choice? The forest doesn't care about your desires. It only cares about what it needs. And now it has you. You must face what's coming." Before he could respond, the ground beneath him trembled again, stronger this time, as if something immense was moving beneath the earth. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches groaning as if in warning. The creatures that had been chasing him now appeared around him, their grotesque shapes emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with malice. He was surrounded. The creatures advanced slowly, their movements unnatural, like shadows stretching toward him. His chest tightened with fear, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out from the sheer terror of it all. There was no way out. No way to escape. But then, something in him snapped. The pendant, pulsing with energy in his hand, seemed to vibrate with a strange force, calling to him. He didn't know how, but in that moment, he understood. The pendant was the key. Not just to the forest's power, but to its heart. He had to use it. He had to face whatever was coming. "Stop!" he shouted, holding the pendant high above his head, the words echoing through the forest. The creatures paused, their twisted faces turning toward him in eerie unison. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. He felt a surge of energy course through him, and the pendant in his hand grew hotter, its glow intensifying until it illuminated the entire clearing. The creatures began to back away, as if repelled by its light, their twisted forms flickering in and out of existence. The figure who had been watching him stepped back, its eyes widening in what could almost be called fear. "What are you doing?" the figure hissed, its voice cracking with rage. The pendant's light grew brighter still, and the forest around him seemed to tremble in response. The creatures, once closing in on him, now recoiled, their unnatural movements jerky and hesitant. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, and from the depths of the earth, someone began to rise. At first, he thought it was another creature, something even darker, but then he saw it, a figure, human but different. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood, but its presence was undeniable. The figure radiated power, an ancient force that made the entire forest seem to bow in reverence. The creatures stepped back, their twisted forms trembling in its presence. The figure's voice boomed, rich and deep, carrying across the forest like a thunderclap. Enough. The creatures, the shadowed figure, and even the very air seemed to obey this command. Everything went still, and for a moment, he could hear nothing but his own racing heartbeat. "You have awakened me," the figure continued, its voice like the earth itself speaking. "And for that, you shall be rewarded. But know this, the forest is mine. And it will always be mine. I am its heart. Its soul. And now, it is time to restore the balance." He stood frozen, the pendant still glowing in his hand. He had no idea who or what this new figure was, but its presence was overwhelming, far more ancient and powerful than anything he had encountered. It was clear now he was only a small part of something vast, something beyond his understanding. The figure raised its hand, and the world seemed to shift around him. The trees bent and groaned, the ground split open beneath his feet, and the creatures, those twisted beings, began to dissolve, their forms vanishing into the air like smoke. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the world went silent. For a long moment he stood there, the pendant now cool in his hand, and the forest around him eerily still. The shadows lifted, the fog dissipated, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. But he knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The ancient figure, now standing before him, extended a hand. "You have proven yourself worthy. The forest has accepted you, but it is not over. You will return to it, as part of its soul. Its guardian. And there is no turning back." As the figure's words sank in, the final, unexpected twist hit him like a tidal wave. He hadn't just stumbled into the forest's mystery. He hadn't just found the lost pony. He had been chosen to become a part of the forest itself. The pendant, the creatures, the figure, it had all led him here, to this moment. And now, as the forest's true power enveloped him, he understood. The secret wasn't just about the woods. The secret was about him. He had become the forest's keeper. The final test wasn't about survival, it was about acceptance. And in that moment, everything changed. The forest around him seemed to shift once again, though this time, it was not the oppressive, dangerous atmosphere he had felt before. It felt as though the air had cleared, like a weight had been lifted, and the oppressive tension that had gripped him for so long was now dissipating. The ancient figure in front of him, still cloaked in shadow, spoke once more. "You will understand the forests will soon enough," the figure said, its voice now soft, almost like a whisper. "But you must remember what you've learned here, the power you hold, is not something to be taken lightly. The woods will test you again. It always does." The realization struck him then. This was not over. This moment, this strange, almost sacred encounter with the forest's heart, was only the beginning. And now, it wasn't just about survival, it was about responsibility. His heart pounded as the weight of the figure's words settled into his bones. He had been chosen for something bigger than himself. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for. "What? What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The figure remained silent for a moment, as though contemplating how best to answer. Then it stepped closer, its presence commanding and yet not threatening. "The forest has always chosen guardians. You are the newest. And it is time for you to protect it. To ensure the balance is maintained." He tried to process the figure's words, but they didn't make sense. He wasn't a protector. He was just a boy who had stumbled upon a lost pony, a strange pendant, and an ancient forest. None of this had ever been a part of his plan. And yet, here he stood, face to face with something far older and more powerful than he could have imagined, being asked to become something he didn't feel he was. The figure took a step back, its shadow stretching across the ground as the mist from the trees began to swirl around them. "You may not understand now, but in time you will. The forest has a way of revealing itself, piece by piece, to those it chooses. You will see things, hear things, know things that no other human can." And just like that, the figure began to fade, its form blurring into the darkness. "It is time for you to return," it murmured, its voice growing distant. "But remember, if you abandon the forest, it will abandon you." The last words echoed in his mind as the figure disappeared entirely, leaving him alone in the clearing. The creatures that had once surrounded him were now gone, their twisted forms dissolved into the earth, leaving nothing behind but the quiet rustle of leaves. He stood there, motionless, as the reality of what had just transpired slowly sank in. The forest was alive. He had awakened it. and he was now part of it. He glanced down at the pendant in his hand, still warm to the touch. It felt different now, less like a strange artifact, more like an extension of himself. He closed his fingers around it tightly, feeling a surge of power course through him, like the forest's very heart beating in time with his own. As he began to walk back through the woods, the trees seemed to shift in a way that felt deliberate. They parted as he approached, guiding him through the dense foliage. The path seemed clearer now, as though it recognized him, as though it was a path he had always known, even if he had never walked it before. The deeper he walked, the more he began to notice things, small, subtle things he had never paid attention to before. The way the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying secrets he couldn't yet understand. The way the shadows shifted, like they were alive, moving with purpose. The way the animals in the forest seemed to watch him, their eyes glowing with a knowing intelligence. They were no longer creatures to fear, they were his allies, his companions. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin and the familiar sights of the town appeared in the distance, he felt a strange sense of peace. The forest had allowed him to leave. It had chosen him, but it wasn't keeping him trapped. Not yet, anyway. As he stood there, just beyond the tree line, he took one last look at the forest that had changed everything. He wasn't the same boy who had entered it just hours ago. He had seen things, felt things, learned things that were beyond his understanding. But he knew one thing for sure: he would never be the same again. The pendant, still warm in his hand, pulsed once more, as though in answer to his thoughts. And as he glanced up toward the sky, he saw the stars twinkling, bright and clear, but somehow different than before. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He could feel the forest's pulse in the air, as though it was watching him, waiting for his next move. But for now, he stood still. He wasn't ready to face whatever came next. Not yet. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of disconnection, as though the world around him had lost its sharpness. He tried to return to his normal life: school, chores, spending time with his family, but everything felt off. He couldn't explain it. The woods were calling to him, always present in the back of his mind, tugging at him like an invisible thread. And then, one evening, as the sun set and the sky darkened with twilight, he felt it, a pull, soft and insistent. The forest had summoned him again. Without thinking, he grabbed the pendant from his dresser and slipped it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to return. He had no choice. The moment he stepped into the woods, the familiar sense of power surrounded him. The air was thick with the same energy he had felt before, the sense that the forest was alive, aware of his presence. He walked deeper this time, not knowing exactly where he was headed, but trusting that the forest would guide him. It always had. Hours passed in what felt like moments, until he found himself in a clearing, standing before a large stone structure that had never been there before. It was ancient, its surface weathered by time, covered in vines and moss, but there was no mistaking its significance. This was the heart of the forest. The place the forest had been leading him to all along. As he approached the stone, a voice, soft, familiar, echoed through the trees. "You have come." The words sent a chill down his spine. It was the figure, the one who had told him the forest's secrets. But now, it was not just the figure. It was something more. The voice was all around him, inside him, as though the forest itself was speaking. "You are ready now," the voice continued. "The balance is fragile. The forest is both a protector and a destroyer. You must be both. The choice is yours." His heart raced as he looked around the clearing. He didn't fully understand the weight of the words, but he knew one thing: the forest had chosen him for a reason. He was its guardian now, and his life would never be the same. The woods would test him again, of that he was certain. But he was ready. He had no choice but to be. As the wind rustled the leaves and the stars began to shimmer above, he understood. This was just the beginning. The forest had secrets, mysteries that even he couldn't fathom. But one thing was clear: he would protect it, and in turn, it would protect him. Together, they were part of something far larger than either of them could ever comprehend. And with that, the forest embraced him once more, its heart beating in time with his own.